Before this video starts, I believe it to be extremely relevant to at least briefly talk about the recent events that have drastically affected the future of Toys for Bob. It absolutely pains me and many others to say that an estimated 40% of their studio lost their jobs in the recent Microsoft layoffs. I really hope that the employees who suffered from this are already on a new and exciting path, and I hope the employees who remain try and hold on to the admittedly low morale they must have at this moment, and nurture it for the future. As news broke out even more recently, Toys for Bob has officially detached itself from the ownership of Activision Microsoft, officially becoming an independent studio. For TFB's future, this seems incredibly exciting. Sadly with that, these changes have brought about the end of Crash Team Rumble. Instead of the anticipated Season 4, Toys for Bob instead decided to leave us with a 500 tier free battle pass, so that everyone can collect every item in the game, new and old. And with that, our Rumble days, while brief, are being left behind. I'm not sure whether this video will mark the final time I will talk about Rumble, as I always predicted that the game would reach at least Season 5, and even then I thought I was being pessimistic. But regardless, if you don't see any new Crash Team Rumble content after this, just know that it has been an absolute pleasure and blast to work on these videos each season. But if you decide to stick around, there's a whole franchise of Crash games that I still plan to make videos on, so it's not all doom and gloom. I wish Toys for Bob the absolute best in the future, and I'll be watching with a keen eye at their future ventures. Thank you guys for listening. I will now hard cut to our regularly scheduled video. Welcome back to another Crash Team Rumble seasonal wrap-up. This time, let's turn back time a few months and dissect the third season of Crash Team Rumble. The big draw of this season was the massive amount of Spyro the Dragon representation, whether that be with maps, items, cosmetics, and of course, the purple boy himself. This season was all about Spyro and his various friends and locales. From Rumble's first announcement, the thought of Spyro making an appearance was on a lot of people's minds. Despite it feeling like a sure thing, it wasn't until Season 2's calendar that Spyro's tail tipped off that it was official. The season was set to begin on the 7th of December, coincidentally the same day as the Game Awards. This did lead to some heavy speculation that a fourth Spyro game would be announced alongside the start of the season. Obviously that didn't happen. Not even a trailer to remind people that Rumble still existed, but regardless, that's a completely different conversation for a completely different video. On the 7th of December, Spyro the Dragon dropped, and he was a super weird character to get used to at first. You see, most of the characters in Rumble so far either control almost identical to how they did in Crash 4, or have never been controllable in any large way before this game. So getting used to their playstyles felt natural. But Spyro is a radically different beast. I'd call myself a Spyro enthusiast. I'd even go as far as to call myself a Spyro fan. A large one even. That being said, my muscle memory with the original and the Reignited trilogy did not prepare me for how he controls in Rumble. Now don't get it twisted, his moveset makes sense. Most of it familiar, but square to flame? What is this, a hero's tail? And R2 to charge, circle to head bash. The differences threw me for a loop the first few times I took him out for a spin, but after a week of using him, Spyro became my go-to character for most of the season. His speed is unmatched by anyone on the roster, barring a full-scale dive from Catbat, which makes him incredibly versatile, especially when on call to your teammates. He can be anywhere within seconds, and even though his charge does have a cooldown, with some cheeky button presses, you can keep his speed practically endlessly. One of his moves that took far more to get used to though was the head bash. Pressing circle while in the air triggers it, which on its own is simple enough, but press it twice and Spyro does his own version of Coco's corkscrew attack. If you find yourself accidentally pressing circle one too many times, your bullseye head bash could be ruined. You need it to be calm and precise, as to not ruin your positioning. This goes for gliding as well. Learning how to turn your glide on and off in tandem with your other moves was another skill worth mastering. But in return, you get the most mobile, viciously aggressive scorer in the game. The in-game event had you collecting dragon eggs, and despite not having a new Spyro game to look forward to, it was nice to play Spyro in a 3D platforming environment once again. A patch also released alongside this update, finally adding emoting to the lobby. This was an addition I was patiently waiting for. Emoting in games has always been a tricky thing. Sure, you could emote after defeating an enemy, but it always felt like you'd be wasting time that could have been spent traveling to the other end of the map. At least now you can share your favorite emote moves with your teammates. Career stats were also added. It was slightly underwhelming that the stats started from 0 rather than displaying the last 6 months of Rumble, but either way, it was nice to have. There was also a buff to Embryo. Now his slimes would never explode in midair and always make it to the ground. Another buff to Brio, allowing him to transform into brute form in midair. A buff to Catbat, adding one flap after being knocked back. A buff to Cortex, restoring vertical dash after being knocked back. A buff to Engine, improving homing shots and blast off and boombox cooldown when being knocked back. A buff to Ripto's double jump when using his Tsunami move. A buff to Power Drainer, now allowing it to damage close by powers like guards and fridges. A buff to Garbage Dump, distributing more garbage evenly. They also fixed a pretty bad glitch that would have ally Brio slimes slow your team's banking as if it was an enemy slime. This update firmly places Brio in the upper echelon of blockers, and even became my personal favourite blocker, which is crazy since he was my second least favourite character at launch, though blockers still remain my least favourite type of character. On the 14th of December, 4 events started all at once, that being the 2-week-long winter event, the Artisans Arena map event, the What's Juicing party mode event, and the Clockstravaganza XP event. The Clockstravaganza event was just some hefty extra XP to collect while collecting clocks in party mode, which worked really well alongside the release of What's Juicing, a new party mode set on Just Beachy. It's essentially a retread of the What's Cooking party mode, but with different assets used, plus a few extra variables, like ice cubes melting if you hold them for too long, and dodo birds that you need to throw through the fire pit to cook them. The boss is also quite different. Louise makes a return from Crash 4, requiring you to lob barrels of TNT through fire pits to explode on impact. This game is a perfect example of how game types can be repurposed in other maps, and though we do get another example of this later in the season, it's sad we'll never actually see this reach its full potential. Like the Halloween event, the winter event was a 2-week-long pass that had every character receive a frosty-themed skin. It also gave a cool wintry coat of paint to every existing map. It ran parallel to the release of the Artisan Arena map release, and boy do I have a major bone to pick with how this event shook up. It was stated that the Hot Cocoa would be showing up in competitive and party mode, and be the main collectible of the event. However, when it came time to start the event, the collectibles would only show up in party mode. For a while that would have been fine, but party mode isn't as replayable as regular competitive. Toys for Bob did increase the drop rate of the Cocoa to have it show up twice per round, which was curious because if they were able to make that fix, why didn't they just fix it to show up in competitive? I don't know the inside outs of how they go about fixing these issues, but I thought it was important to bring up, especially because of what ended up happening further into the season. Artisans Arena as a map was pretty cool. The Wumpa was naturally changed to be gems, and the relic stations included fairies, ice wizards, and gulp. The fairies bestowed an attack or defense buff, and could make you impossible to deal with if you managed to unlock both. The ice wizards take control on these specific parts of the map, and will freeze any enemies that spend a little too long in their sights. And Gulp will shoot energy blasts and smash himself down on the ground, making it incredibly difficult for the opposing team to score, especially if there's anyone on their bank slowing the process down. On the 19th of December, a new patch released. A buff to Minefield, increasing its time active and charge time. A nerf to Cortex, increasing cooldown for his dash. A nerf to Jump Crates, increasing its charge time. And a buff to Crash, improving his Super Slam. This update definitely made Cortex a little harder to pilot. I'd gotten fairly used to how often I can use his dash. Now I can attribute some deaths purely because of the increase of cooldown for it. On the 21st of December, Wumpa Whale returned as a full-scale mode. Slight changes included these rubber ducks that can be collected by each team to either remove the whale or keep it around longer, depending on whether you spawn the whale or not. The mode is slightly better than the TFB lab version, but the game still feels like spawning the whale once is enough to turn the tide of the game for good, and no amount of rubber ducks would be able to change it. On the 4th of January, a new character comes to Rumble. Elora. She is considered a blocker by the game's standards, but not your typical one. Her combat and defensive levels are not the best, but her mobility is fairly good. Her real power comes from her healing capabilities. R2 will have you float and heal yourself and ally players. You can put yourself just out of the action and support a fellow player in winning a fight with an enemy. She's pretty fun, but still personally doesn't beat Brio to the top blocker spot. For her event, you had to collect leaves, and by this point it seemed that TFB had established how they wanted events to run, with the daily limit and pass amount. Bank Swap also returned as a proper mode, and was a very cool shake-up to the formula. Having to pay attention to when the banks would swap so you wouldn't fall behind in the game was a pretty small but genius way to change things up. There was this interesting glitch where if you happened to be on the bank at the exact frame it would swap, it would take your character with it. I was only able to have this happen a couple times, and it felt like it became impossible to replicate after a while, but still, I thought the glitch was really cool. On the 11th of January, the new power of the season dropped. Bank Portal. Now this power I was very curious to see in action. Thankfully it wasn't yet another explosion based power up, but instead a strategic displacement device, or you know, a portal. This power up takes you straight to your bank when used, allowing for quicker banking, especially useful if you're on a massive map. For the blockers of the game, holding down the power button will instead take you to the enemy bank, allowing you to get the drop on unsuspecting players. Across the board this power up is a solid pick, it works exactly as advertised, and it feels like it works great on characters such as Crash, Brio, or Dingodile, characters that would certainly like the help to travel long distances. Collecting magic dust this time netted you the event rewards. But that wasn't the only event this week. Wumparama made a grand return, and with everyone itching to use the new Bank Portal power-up, it made the game mode this time absolutely chaos. If you thought the games were over fast last time, having an enemy completely evade you on the other side of the map and suddenly bank for game was all too common. Though being able to transform into Brio and then use your own Bank Portal was pretty fun as well. On the 18th of January, a new map, party mode, and event coincided. Summer Forest was unleashed on players, and and is by far the biggest map the game has. Out of all the characters, it's no surprise Spyro doesn't mind the open space to charge around, but even with the many supercharge pads and gates, I found the map a little too tedious to traverse. The relic stations, however, are very cool. Moneybags is able to give you a Wumpa Stash style bag of gems, which can actually be affected by your own Wumpa Stash if you have it equipped. Random thieves can also be found around the map and will give you a bag of gems as well. So the scoring potential alone in this map is huge. There's a tower bank barrage-like relic station, and the epic relic station are these elemental orbs that you can use to add upgrades to your melee attacks. Opponents are able to knock the orbs off the map, but your time would be better spent running away from the supercharged enemies. The Forest Run party mode also released today, the second version of Speedrun, but on the Summer Forest map. The boss is Bob the Flag Keeper from Spyro 2, which honestly makes a lot of sense when you think about what his mission entails in Ripto's Rage. And apart from the Tokens of Annihilation event that also coincided, nothing else happened this week. Except, well, the Hot Cocoa returned. In competitive at least. Yes, even though the winter event happened an entire month ago, the glitch repeated itself. Only this time, the other way around. The dragon statues that you should have been collecting were stuck to party mode, while the Hot Cocoa appeared in competitive. And this time, Toys for Bob decided not to double the drop rate. So we all literally had to play double the amount of party mode as last time, when we should have been able to choose not to play party mode at all. This caused me to only really have 2 or 3 games in Summer Forest in the entire event, because most of my remaining time had to be spent collecting a single dragon statue slowly, once every party mode. Luckily it seems some others we matched with had the same idea, because by the last 20 statues, our teammates were allowing the game to time out after like round 1 or 2, speeding up the process of collecting the statues just a bit. Here's where I'd hope the next event collectible works correctly, but that was the last fully fledged event this game will have. On the 23rd of January, a new patch released. A change to Wumpa Whale's relic cost from 50 to 40, a decrease to Louise's health, a buff to the Gulp relic station's damage output, a massive buff to Ripto's attacks across the board, a nerf to Spyro's Wumpa capacity, a buff to Entropy's damage output, a buff to Elora's damage output. This patch absolutely saved Ripto from remaining at the bottom of the barrel in terms of playability, and even though I'm still not a fan of playing as him, he is admittedly a lot better now. On the 1st of February, Zap Trap returned for the last time. Nothing was inherently different about the mode, but because of the new inclusion of Spyro, using him was far more popular in this mode over the weekend than any other character. On the 15th of February, Wumpa Whale returned with its new relic cost. It didn't make much of a difference, and I still feel like Wumpa Whale fails at being an interesting mode. It would have been cool to see more variety of TFB lab modes added and upgraded to full events. On the 22nd of February, the final event of the season started, the return of Bank Swap. The new inclusion of Bank Portal made things a little less consequential for the players who chose that. Other than that, still a fun mode. And that brings us to the 29th of February. By this point, Season 3 was supposed to end, and the predicted upon Season 4 would begin. Though news about that season was suspiciously absent, and as players awaited the Battle Pass timer to tick over, they were instead granted an extra week to grind XP. This didn't bode well for players. After the unfortunate layoffs, it felt inevitable that something had to give for Toys for Bob to continue as a studio, and sadly, it had to be Rumble. Later this day, a post was made on the blog announcing the studio was separating from Activision and becoming independent, citing a friendly relationship that was striking up between them and Microsoft. It seemed TFB was moving on to greater pastures, and Crash Team Rumble was not making the cut. They announced a single final update that would add a 500 tier battle pass, free for all players. Crash coins were also removed from stores. The battle pass would contain every item from previous seasons, as well as new ones, and by the 4th of March, that's where the game has been left. Empty and barren. As of recording, events have begun to recycle through, starting back at Badge Bonanza. I can only assume that it will continue to loop through until support for the game ceases. I think part of all of us knew the game wouldn't live for long, but even I thought the game would reach 5 seasons before kicking the bucket. Knowing how surprisingly healthy and tight-knit the Crash Team Racing online community is, Rumble will still get played to some degree in the future. But in terms of new videos, unless something radical were to happen, this will officially be my last Crash Team Rumble video. But before we go, some quick statistics. I held a few polls on my YouTube community tab to see what my viewers, as slim as the number is, thought their favourite hero from each category was now that all the balance updates have obviously ended. Now I only got about 10 or so votes on each of the polls, so the results aren't exactly accurate to the opinions of the entire Rumble community, but let's discuss what we ended up with anyway. For blockers, Dingodile and Entropy both share the 5th and 4th place spot at 0% of the votes. This is interesting, especially in Tropy's case, as she was cited as the best blocker when the game first launched, but with a combination of new strategies and massive nerfs, she fell from grace easily. Dingodile was always the most standard of the blockers, so I'm not totally surprised that his playstyle became a bit stale for players. Ripperoo and Elora both share the third and second place with 25% of the votes each. These two play very differently to your typical blocker, with Ripperoo focusing on more chip damage and Elora on healing. A player known as Boots and Kets championed Ripperoo especially well during games. And in first place, Embryo is 50% of all the votes. With the addition of the strafe button, some well-needed buffs, and some ingenuity from players, Brio has been absolutely figured out by now, with fellow Rumbler Jubiloop being one of the best and most consistent players using him. For boosters, Ripto landed in last place at 9%. This isn't all too surprising, as he's long been the most underpowered character in the game, but the 9% he did score would definitely come from fans of his recent buff that allowed him to keep pace with everyone else. Cortex followed at 18%. When the game initially launched, I would have told you that Cortex was the strongest character to use if you were good at the game. His high skill ceiling allowed players to excel with him after enough practice, though a couple nerfs have understandably placed him at third. In second place, we have the second character added to the game, Engine, at 27%. I know some people were a little underwhelmed at his addition, but for me, Engine came at a time I was looking for a new favourite booster after Coco reached level 15, and Engine was just fun and strong enough to fill that void. And at 45% in first place, it's of course Coco. She was my favourite character from the very start, and still remains to this day. Even after an unfortunate nerf to her wall cooldowns, I think she comfortably sits atop all the other boosters as the best. GTR, another fellow Rumbler, was a very experienced Coco, and made it known whenever he was your opponent. For scorers, sharing last place together is Torna and Catbat. I have to attest that both of these are excellent characters, Catbat especially being a favourite of mine after being accustomed to the dive burger stall technique. 1v1ing opponents at attaining gem paths was always a breeze when I was playing Catbat. Torna's melee combo, while strong, didn't seem to allow her to trade quite as well with the other characters of the game. I do think she deserved a slight buff in the end, but how she is how she'll stay. At second place with 27%, the newcomer Spyro. Now Spyro did recently have a nerf to his Wumpa capacity, from 120 to 100. But I don't think that changes how viciously fast he can be at scoring. With the right movement technique and a smart team composition, a single Spyro can be tasked with solely scoring while the other team deals with everything else. He's just that good. But at first place with a hefty 55% is, funnily enough, Crash Bandicoot himself. Now, truth be told, I doubted his ability to keep up with the other characters, even having him at the bottom of my list in my launch review. But this tank of a character has proven time and time again to be the most effective scorer in the game. He's strong, fast, holds by far the most Wumpa at 140, and has a slide move that trades with practically every attack in the game. He is the best at actually maintaining his position on the bank, and can quite easily take down enemy blockers if need be. I was absolutely wrong about him from the very start, and even though he has had some buffs to help him over the months, he really was always this good when you look at the facts. And that, my friends, is basically all I have left to talk about when it comes to Crash Team Rumble. I'd like to thank the Asia Pacific Rumble community on PlayStation for helping me out whenever I just needed to get that last event collectible, and just being there for all the fun games we did during the seasons. And I'd also like to thank my brother Sir Badger for being there every time I was online to play Rumble, making the experience better. It's sad to see it all go, but if there's one thing I know for sure about the Crash community, it's that they are loyal, patient, and committed to seeing the franchise succeed in every way it deserves. While the servers remain up, I think I'll always find time here and there to play a Rumble game or two. But even though the seasons and concurrently my videos on the game have come to an end, it's only the beginning for me and my videos on the franchise as a whole. If you guys stick around, I plan to do a new review series starting from the first Crash Bandicoot all the way through the series' many highs and lows. Please subscribe to join me on that journey, and I'd like to very much thank you all for watching DaAcorn.